this mountain. Ring like mine, boy, ring like mine. Oh, there's a song there, but that's not just a song. The rhythm of that song was actually used to measure something. See, back in the old days, when men used hammers to drive drills into rock when they were building railroads, a song like that was used to measure when the hammer would strike. And the reason was that what that hammer was striking was a drill held by a human being who would turn it and wait for the next hammer blow, and then turn it and wait for the next hammer blow. And he would listen to the hammerman singing that song, and he would know when to expect the impact and know when to turn the drill. Well, that song's especially associated with one hammer-wielding, steel-driving man, and that's John Henry. Now, folks know John Henry from the songs and the stories, but you see, he wasn't just a song, he wasn't just a story. John Henry was a real man. There are arguments about who he was, but there's a historian back in Virginia who thinks he's figured it out, and I agree with him because the story that he tells makes sense, and that's this story. You see, John Henry was a young man at the end of the Civil War. His mother was free when he was born, and so John Henry was never a slave himself. But he understood what slavery was like from what he'd seen. He and his mother lived in a state where slavery was legal. And so when he was 18 years old, he went to work for the Union Army in Petersburg near Richmond, Virginia. 1866. The pay wasn't good, but it was better than nothing, and he was doing something he felt was important. And when you worked for the Union Army in a place like that, part of your pay was food and clothes, and those clothes looked almost like an army uniform, and that made him feel so happy. Now, the nearest big city was Richmond, not far away, and he would go there once in a while. He loved seeing that big city. But for a black man in a blue uniform, even if it wasn't a soldier's uniform, that was a terrible mistake to make. And so it was that in Richmond, John Henry was arrested. He was charged with stealing from a store there that sold groceries and little 5-cent and penny things. And when he was brought into the court, the prosecutor said, "Your Honor, this man stole $20 worth of merchandise from the store in question." And the judge said, "Now, wait a minute. I know about that store. That store sells things for pennies and nickels. There's no way a human being could steal $20 worth of merchandise from that store." And the prosecutor came up and said, "Well, Your Honor, what would you believe that somebody could steal from that store?" And he looked over at John Henry. Now, John Henry was not a big man, but he was a strong man from working that he'd done with the supplies for the army. I suppose a fellow like that might be able to steal $10 worth of stuff if he tried real hard. "Your Honor, just a moment." And the prosecuting attorney went over and talked to the storekeeper a minute and came back and announced to the court, "Your Honor, we are charging this man with stealing $10 worth of merchandise from that store." And John Henry said, "But Your Honor, I didn't do anything like that." And the judge said, Now, I've already decided you're guilty. The question is what you're guilty of. So don't interrupt." And so it was that in the courts of Virginia, John Henry was convicted of stealing $10 worth of merchandise from a store. It was said that he'd never stolen anything from there, but maybe he'd argued with the storekeeper over something. And in those days in Virginia, that was enough to get a black man charged with a crime. And in those days, $10 worth of merchandise stolen from a store, the sentence was 10 years in the Virginia State Prison. It was funny how almost all the prisoners convicted of the Virginia State Prison were African Americans at that time, but so it was. And also so it was that the Virginia State Prison had a new prison warden who had a great idea. Having men sitting around in a prison, why, that was just downright unhealthy, and besides that, it was expensive. And so he would rent them out to businesses that needed workers. Now, as it happened, there was a railroad being built across Virginia at that time by a man named Collis Huntington. And Mr. Huntington, he had this great idea. He wanted to go on and build a railroad all the way across the United States. But before he could do that, he had to prove some of the ideas and also have a profitable railroad that he was running to make money to finance it. And he'd made a deal with the state of Virginia to build a railroad through some of the toughest land of Virginia, land where there'd never been a railroad before because there were too many mountains in the way, too much hard rock. There were folks in Virginia that said the Lord had to rest on the seventh day because before that, he'd put so much effort into putting these mountains here in Virginia. Just plumb wore him out. Well, he tried to bring in hard rock miners to dig tunnels through the places that the tunnels had to be dug. And the miners took a look and said, yeah, we can do that. Take a couple of years, but we can do it. And Collis Huntington said, no, I need it done faster than that. And they said, well, good luck to you then, because we're not going to do it faster than that. It wouldn't be safe. And so Collis Huntington paid the Virginia State Prison for prisoners to do the work that professionals had considered unsafe. One of the jobs, the one that John Henry proved best at, was swinging a hammer driving a drill into rock. Now, there are two reasons for doing that. One is if you drive a drill into the rock, you make a space for explosives to be put in, and you put in a little bit of explosive, and you set that off, and it shears off rock. Then you drag out the rubble, and you do that again. And over the course of time, you slowly build a tunnel with steel driven into the rock, and then explosive dragging down pieces of the rock, and then you go on. The other is when you got the tunnel in place, you have to drive ventilation holes into the tunnel. And you start at the top of the rock above the tunnel, and you drive holes in. If you've done it right, you have to drill a certain distance into the rock to punch the starter hole in so that you can make the ventilation holes. Well, John Henry swung a hammer. He wasn't a giant of a man, but he knew how to swing a hammer, and he knew how to swing it and hit that drill so that the shaker, the man holding the hammer, was always safe as could be, and so he could drive that drill into the rock, and the explosives could be planted, and the rock could be blown up. The problem is that rushing a job like that, well, the reason it's not safe to rush is you need to wait for the dust to settle, because dust can get into people's lungs, and that hard rock dust can cause problems, a thing called silicosis, a thing where the rock is eating away at your lungs. Well, these weren't professional hard rock miners. They didn't know about that. And besides, they were just being rented from the prison, so no problem. The funny thing was that when it got to the Lewis Tunnel that they were cutting through West Virginia, there was a company that brought in a steam drill and said, we can do that job better than your man. And so it was that there was a contest between hammer driving men and steam drills at both of those jobs, at driving a drill into solid rock as you're digging the tunnel, and at driving a drill down into rock to form the ventilation holes of the tunnel. Now, in the song John Henry, there's some funny references to that contest. It was a real contest, but some of it probably doesn't make sense to you, because there's a line in that song about how John Henry drove 14 feet and the steam drill only drove 9. Well, the reason for that was that 14 feet was the amount of distance you had to drive into the rock from above to create the starter hole for the ventilation shafts. And the steam drill, it broke down. It couldn't do it. In fact, even at the rock faces where they were digging the tunnel, it spent so much time being repaired that John Henry and men like him outdrove that steam drill. Well, that was good for Collis Huntington because with John Henry and the other workers from the prison, he finished that railroad. He got all the tunnels cut. They dug through mountains. They dug through things that nobody thought could ever be dug through. And that railroad began running. But John Henry, he didn't have a heart attack from wielding that hammer. He didn't work himself to death from not eating or drinking while he swung hammers for too many hours in a row. No, he probably died from the silicosis, from the rock eating into his lungs. He and 300 other men were taken back to the Virginia State Penitentiary over the course of time and buried there under the buildings because they died working for Collis Huntington. One of the versions of the song makes reference to they took John Henry to the White House and buried him in the sand. And every time a train goes by, they say, there lies a steel-driving man. But they didn't mean the White House in Washington, D.C. The main building at the state prison at Virginia, the one where they buried people under the building and didn't give their names the right places in the record so that nobody could count how many had died while hired out. They called that building the White House because it was a big old white painted building that you could see for miles. Well, John Henry was buried there, and soon after his death, the story came out. It was actually sung by workers on the railroad that Collis Huntington had built. We don't know the names of the other men for the most part who worked on that railroad for Mr. Huntington, but John Henry was the one that folks remembered because he was a young man and a strong man, and he could swing a steel hammer like anything and drive those drills into the rock from in front or from above to get the things done. But you know, Collis Huntington, with the money from that railroad and from his bet that he could drive a tunnel through rocks that God himself had gotten tired of building, he did build that transcontinental railroad. And after he built that, and after he made his fortunes building railroads, he left a lot of that money to his nephew, Henry Huntington, who came out here and built trolley cars all across Los Angeles. And he built a big mansion just south of the edge of Pasadena, a mansion that's a library and museum now, a place where people do research about history, to learn about the past. And Huntington Drive is one of the places where his trolley cars ran. But the money for that mansion and the money to build those trolley lines and the reason why people remember Henry Huntington is because of the money that Collis Huntington made by working men like John Henry to their graves. So at the edge of Pasadena, if you go by the Huntington Library, you look up there and you remember a steel-driving man because that's what it's all about. And that's the true story of John Henry.